I'm Emma Rodriguez, 28, and I'm a licensed therapist who specializes in childhood trauma. Ironic, considering my own story. When I was 9 years old, my older brother Marcus sold my entire collection of vintage toys to buy himself candy while I was at summer camp. These weren't just any toys, they were my late grandmother's antique dolls worth over $3,000, my only connection to her memory. My parents laughed it off as kids being kids and refused to make him replace them. Well, last week I discovered Marcus still owes me something. His precious 2019 Mustang just happened to cover my therapy bills perfectly. Sometimes the best revenge is healing yourself with their consequences. Like this video if you believe childhood betrayals deserve adult justice, and subscribe for more stories about family karma coming full circle. But let me take you back to where it all began. The Rodriguez family of Denver, Colorado looked perfect from the outside. Dad was a successful insurance agent, Mom worked as a bank manager, and we lived in a pristine two-story house with a white picket fence that screamed suburban success. The Christmas photo from 1995 tells the whole story. There's Marcus, 13 and already towering over me, his arm draped protectively around my shoulders while we both smile at the camera. What the photo doesn't show is how he'd been systematically tormenting me for years. Marcus was everything my parents wanted in a child. Star quarterback on the high school football team, honor roll student, popular with teachers and classmates alike. He had this effortless charm that made adults fawn over him wherever we went. "Oh, Marcus is such a wonderful big brother," they'd say, watching him ruffle my hair or help me with my backpack. "Emma is so lucky to have him looking out for her." If only they knew what happened behind closed doors. I was the sensitive one. The dreamer, the child who preferred books to sports and art projects to social events. While Marcus collected trophies and accolades, I collected dolls and drew pictures that my parents would glance at before sticking them on the refrigerator. With barely concealed indifference. "That's nice, sweetheart," Mom would say, already turning her attention back to Marcus's latest achievement. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Marcus got the bigger bedroom, the newer clothes, the better Christmas presents. When he wanted something, our parents found a way to make it happen. When I asked for art supplies or books, I was told we needed to be more practical with our spending. Marcus's football equipment cost hundreds of dollars each season, but my request for a $20 set of colored pencils was apparently too extravagant. Looking back now with my professional training, I can see the classic patterns of family dysfunction. The golden child and the scapegoat, the enablers who refused to acknowledge the imbalance they created. But at 9 years old, I just knew that something felt fundamentally unfair about my place in the Rodriguez family hierarchy. I had no idea how much deeper that unfairness would cut. The one person who truly saw me was my grandmother Sophia. She lived 3 blocks away in a Victorian house filled with treasures from her travels across Europe in the 1960s. While my parents dismissed my interests as childish phases, Grandma Sophia understood that my love for beautiful things came from somewhere deeper. Her doll collection was legendary in our neighborhood. 12 exquisite porcelain dolls, each with their own story, their own history. There was Marguerite from Paris, with her elaborate silk dress and real human hair styled in perfect ringlets. Elena from Barcelona, wearing traditional Spanish lace that Sophia had purchased from a convent in 1963. And my personal favorite, Anastasia from Prague, whose emerald eyes seemed to hold secrets from another century. Every Saturday, I would walk to Grandma Sophia's house and she would tell me the stories behind each doll. Not just where she bought them, but the history they represented. Marguerite lived through the Belle Epoque, she would say, adjusting the doll's tiny pearl necklace. She would have attended the opera and danced at grand balls. Can you imagine the stories she could tell? Sophia treated me like the granddaughter she'd always wanted. She taught me about craftsmanship, about the value of things made with care and intention. She showed me how to identify genuine porcelain from cheap imitations, how to appreciate the intricate beadwork on Anastasia's dress, how to understand that these dolls weren't just toys, they were pieces of art, windows into different times and places. When I turned 8, Sophia made the decision that would change everything. She sat me down in her living room, surrounded by the dolls, and handed me a handwritten letter sealed in cream-colored envelope. "This is for you to keep," she said, "but don't open it until you're older. It explains why these dolls are special, and why I'm leaving them all to you." I treasured that letter, keeping it in my jewelry box next to the few pieces of costume jewelry I owned. Sophia had made it clear that the dolls would be mine someday. And I spent hours imagining how I would display them in my future home, how I would care for them and eventually pass their stories on to my own children. 6 months later, Sophia died peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, dignified, exactly what she would have wanted. When the will was read, there it was in black and white: "To my beloved granddaughter Emma Rodriguez, I leave my complete Collection of European porcelain dolls, along with all documentation of their provenance and historical significance. May she treasure them as I have. My parents seemed pleased that I had inherited something of value, though I could tell they viewed the dolls as curiosities rather than treasures. They helped me move the collection to my bedroom, where I arranged them carefully on special shelves Dad installed for me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly wealthy. The summer I turned 9, my parents surprised me with an opportunity to attend Mountain Vista Summer Camp. It was a 2-week program in the Colorado mountains, focused on arts and crafts, nature exploration, and building confidence in shy children. The glossy brochure showed kids laughing around campfires, creating pottery, and hiking through pine forests. For a girl who spent most of her time alone with her dolls and art supplies, it seemed like paradise. I was excited but nervous about leaving home for the first time. The night before departure, I spent hours in my room, making sure everything was perfect for my return. I arranged each doll in a specific position, adjusting Marguerite's silk skirts and making sure Anastasia's emerald eyes caught the afternoon light just right. I even left a note next to Elena from Barcelona: "Please take care of everyone while I'm gone." Marcus appeared in my doorway as I was packing my camp trunk. He leaned against the frame with that casual confidence that came so naturally to him, watching me fold my clothes with the same meticulous care I gave to everything else. 2 whole weeks without Little Miss Perfect, he said, but there was something in his tone I couldn't quite identify. What am I going to do without my favorite sister to boss around? I'm your only sister, I replied, not looking up from my packing. Exactly. He stepped into my room, something he rarely did anymore now that we were older. His eyes swept over my carefully arranged doll collection, lingering on each face. "You know, normal kids your age don't play with dolls anymore." The comment stung, but I was used to Marcus's casual cruelty. "They're not toys," I said quietly. "They're collectibles. Grandma Sophia said they're worth thousands of dollars." Something flickered across Marcus's face: interest, maybe, or calculation. "Thousands? Really?" "Yes, really. That's why I take such good care of them." He nodded slowly, still studying the dolls with newfound attention. "Well, don't worry about them while you're gone. I'll make sure nothing happens to your precious collection." The next morning, Mom and Dad drove me to the camp pickup location downtown. As we pulled away from the house, I pressed my face to the car window, looking up at my bedroom window where I could just make out the silhouettes of my dolls on their shelves. I had no way of knowing it would be the last time I'd see them whole, beautiful, and exactly where they belonged. Camp was everything the brochure promised and more. I made friends with other quiet, artistic kids. I learned to weave friendship bracelets and paint watercolors of mountain landscapes. For 2 weeks, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was valued for who I was rather than compared to what Marcus achieved. I couldn't wait to get home and tell my dolls about every adventure, every new friend, every sunset over the mountains. Mom picked me up on a sunny Thursday afternoon, and I chattered nonstop during the drive home about pottery class and the talent show where I'd performed a dramatic reading. She seemed distracted, giving short responses and glancing at me in the rearview mirror with an expression I couldn't quite read. I assumed she was just tired from work. The house felt different when we walked in. Not physically different, everything looked the same, but there was a tension in the air that made my stomach clench with unease. Dad was in the living room reading the newspaper, and he looked up when we entered with the same strange expression Mom had worn in the car. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he said, but his voice sounded forced, like he was reading lines from a script. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. I dragged my camp trunk upstairs, practically bursting with excitement to reunite with my collection. I'd brought them each a small gift, smooth river stones I'd found during our nature hikes, thinking I could arrange them around the dolls' feet like little gardens. I pushed open my bedroom door and froze. The shelves were empty, not just empty, completely, devastatingly bare. Where 12 beautiful faces had watched over my room for the past year, there was nothing but dust outlines on the wood. The special lighting Dad had installed cast eerie shadows on the vacant spaces where Marguerite, Elena, and Anastasia should have been standing. My camp bag fell from my hands, spilling river stones across the hardwood floor where they scattered like tears. "Mom!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. "Mom, where are my dolls?" She appeared in the doorway within seconds, confirming she'd been waiting for this moment. Her face was a careful mask of composure, but I could see the guilt lurking behind her eyes. "Emma, honey, we need to talk." "Where are they?" I was hyperventilating now, spinning around my room as if the dolls might be hiding somewhere, as if this might all be some cruel joke. "Where are my grandmother's dolls?" "Marcus needed some money for..." "Marcus?" The word came out as a whisper. "What does Marcus have to do with my dolls?" Dad had appeared behind Mom now, both of them filling my doorway like guards. "He found a buyer for them," Dad said, his tone matter of fact. Got a very good price, actually. Much more than we expected. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of my empty bookshelf to keep from falling. A buyer? You sold my dolls? Marcus sold them, Mom corrected, as if the distinction mattered. He needed money for football camp this summer, and you weren't using them anyway. They were just sitting here collecting dust. Collecting dust? I could barely form words. They were my inheritance. They were worth thousands of dollars. Grandma Sophia left them to me. Emma, you need to calm down, Dad said firmly. You're being dramatic. They were toys. They weren't toys. I was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that made my whole body shake. They were mine. He had no right. That's when I learned one of life's cruelest lessons: sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hand you over to the wolves. Marcus finally came home 3 hours later, whistling as he walked through the front door like he didn't have a care in the world. I had spent those hours crying in my empty room while Mom and Dad repeatedly told me I was overreacting and needed to put things in perspective. They'd grown increasingly annoyed with my grief, as if my tears were somehow an inconvenience to their evening routine. I confronted him in the kitchen, my eyes still red and swollen from crying. Where are my dolls, Marcus? He was making himself a sandwich, methodically layering turkey and cheese like we were having a casual conversation about the weather. Oh, those old things? I sold them to some collectors downtown. Got a pretty good deal, actually. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing trading baseball cards, made my stomach lurch. You had no right to sell them. They weren't yours. Come on, Emma. You never even played with them anymore. They were just sitting there taking up space. He took a bite of his sandwich and continued talking with his mouth full. Besides, I needed the money for football camp and new equipment. Coach says if I keep improving, I might get a scholarship to state. I don't care about your football camp. The words exploded out of me with more force than I'd ever used with Marcus before. Those dolls were worth $3,000. They were my inheritance from Grandma Sophia. Marcus paused mid-chew, then shrugged. Yeah, I know. That's why I was able to get such good money for them. How much did you get? $2,800. Not bad for a bunch of old dolls, right? I stared at him in disbelief. He'd gotten nearly full value for them, which meant he'd found serious collectors who understood their worth. This wasn't some impulsive decision by a kid who didn't know better, this was calculated theft. What did you spend it on? I whispered. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled convenience store receipt, tossing it onto the counter like it was nothing. Football camp registration, some new video games, candy, arcade tokens. You know, fun stuff. I grabbed the receipt with shaking hands. $37 for candy and snacks. $60 in arcade tokens. $200 for video games. The football camp fee was legitimate, but the rest was just wasteful spending on temporary pleasures that would be forgotten within weeks. Marcus, Mom said from the doorway, her voice gentle in a way it never was when she spoke to me, maybe you should apologize to your sister. He looked genuinely confused by the suggestion. Apologize for what? I got her a good price. She should be thanking me. That's when Dad stepped in with the words that would echo in my head for the next 19 years. Emma, your brother needed that money for important things. You're old enough to understand that family means sharing and supporting each other. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices. But they were mine, I said weakly, my fight already draining away in the face of their united front. Nothing in this house belongs to just one person, Mom added. We're a family. Marcus would share with you if the situation were reversed. Even at 9 years old, I knew that was a lie. That night, I started a diary. Not the pretty, pink kind with a tiny lock that most girls my age kept, but a plain composition notebook where I could pour out all the feelings that my family didn't want to hear. The first entry was barely legible. Through my tears, August 15th, Marcus stole my dolls and nobody cares. Mom and Dad say I'm being a baby but they were mine. Grandma Sophia gave them to me because she loved me. Now they're gone forever and Marcus spent the money on stupid things. I hate him. I hate all of them. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my young life. I couldn't sleep in my room with those empty shelves staring at me, so I started sneaking into the living room to sleep on the couch. When my parents found me there in the mornings, they would lecture me about moving on and letting go of material things. But they weren't just material things. They were my connection to the one person who had truly seen and valued me. They were proof that I was worthy of love and beautiful things. Without them, I felt invisible again, like I had been before Grandma. Sophia's dolls made me feel special. School became my refuge. 4th grade had started 2 weeks after I returned from camp, and I threw myself into my studies with desperate intensity. If I couldn't be valued at home, maybe I could earn recognition. Through perfect grades and teacher approval. I stayed after school for every available activity, art club, library helper, tutoring younger students, anything to delay going home to that empty room. My teacher, Mrs. Henderson, noticed the change in me almost immediately. Emma seems more withdrawn lately, she told my parents during our first parent-teacher conference. She's always been quiet, but now she seems almost afraid to draw attention to herself. Mom and Dad dismissed her concerns with the same casual indifference they'd shown to my grief. She's just going through a phase, Dad explained. Kids are resilient. She'll bounce back. But I wasn't bouncing back. I was learning to protect myself. I started hiding my few remaining treasures, my art supplies, my favorite books, the small jewelry box that contained Grandma Sophia's letter. I would check on them obsessively, making sure they were still where I'd hidden them, still safe from Marcus's notice. I also started documenting everything. In my diary, I recorded every instance of favoritism, every casual cruelty, every time my feelings were dismissed or minimized. I didn't know why I was doing it then, it felt instinctive. Like evidence gathering. Looking back now with my professional training, I can see I was creating a record of my reality in a family that constantly tried to gaslight me into believing my perceptions were wrong. The hypervigilance that developed during those months would stay with me for years. I learned to sleep lightly, always listening for footsteps outside my door. I learned to treasure things quietly, never expressing too much enthusiasm for fear of drawing unwanted attention to what I loved. Most importantly, I learned that in my family, showing vulnerability was the same as painting a target on your back. By high school, I had perfected the art of emotional invisibility. My sophomore yearbook photo tells the whole story. There I am, sitting in the back row of the Honor Society group shot, my smile polite but distant, my posture carefully controlled. I look like someone who has learned not to take up too much space, not to expect too much attention, not to trust too easily. The years between the doll incident and high school had cemented the family dynamics that would define my adolescence. Marcus continued to be the golden child, his room filled with football trophies and academic awards that my parents displayed with obvious pride. My achievements, honor roll every semester, art contest victories, volunteer work at the local animal shelter, were acknowledged with brief nods and filed away like paperwork. I had learned to stop expecting fairness. When Marcus got a car for his 16th birthday, a used Honda Civic that cost my parents $4,000, I didn't even bother asking what I might receive for mine. When that milestone came 2 years later, I got a card with $50 inside and a lecture about the importance of saving money. You're more practical than Marcus, Mom explained when I pointed out the obvious disparity. You don't need a car as much as he does. He has football practice and college visits. I had a job at the local bookstore, volunteer commitments, and was taking advanced placement classes that required staying after school for study groups, but apparently my transportation needs were less pressing than Marcus's social life. My academic focus had intensified during these years, partly as a coping mechanism and partly as an escape route. I devoured psychology books, fascinated by the dynamics I was living through but couldn't yet name. Words like scapegoat and golden child and emotional neglect started appearing in my diary entries as I tried to understand why my family felt so fundamentally wrong to me. I chose psychology as my intended college major during my junior year, a decision that prompted eye rolls from my parents. Psychology? Dad said when I told them about my college application plans. That's not really a practical career, Emma. Have you considered something more stable, like accounting or nursing? The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus was being encouraged to pursue a sports management degree, hardly the most practical field, but my interest in understanding human behavior was dismissed as unrealistic. My guidance counselor, Ms. Patterson, was the first adult who seemed to truly see me. During our college planning meetings, she would ask thoughtful questions about my interests and goals, treating my answers with respect rather than skepticism. You have real insight into people, she told me during one of our sessions. Your essays about overcoming family challenges show remarkable self-awareness for someone your age. I think you'd make an excellent psychologist. Those words meant more to me than any trophy or award ever could. For the first time since Grandma Sophia's death, an adult was validating my worth based on who I was rather than dismissing me for who I wasn't. I applied to colleges across the country, but especially focused on schools far from Denver. The thought of staying close to home, of remaining trapped in the family dynamics that had shaped my childhood, felt suffocating. I needed distance to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly being compared to Marcus or dismissed for being too sensitive. My acceptance letter to Northwestern University arrived on a cold March afternoon. The psychology program was excellent, the campus was beautiful, and most importantly, it was 800 miles away from the house where my dreams had been sold for candy money. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel genuinely excited about the future. Northwestern University was everything I had dreamed of and more. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued intellectual curiosity over athletic achievement, who asked thoughtful questions instead of dismissing complex emotions as phases. My dorm room was small but entirely mine. No one could take my belongings, sell my treasures, or invade my space without permission. The psychology department became my sanctuary. Professor Martinez, who taught Introduction to Developmental Psychology, was the first person to put clinical terms to the family dynamics I had lived through. When she lectured about scapegoating in family systems, about how some children become repositories for family dysfunction while others are idealized, I felt like she was describing my exact childhood. During office hours, I found myself opening up to her in ways I had never opened up to anyone. "Have you considered personal therapy?" she asked gently after I had shared some of my family experiences. Understanding psychology academically is valuable, but processing your own experiences with a professional could be transformative. The idea terrified me. I had spent so many years being told that my feelings were wrong, that my perceptions were skewed, that I was too sensitive. What if a therapist agreed with my parents? What if I really was the problem? But Professor Martinez gave me a referral to Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and childhood emotional neglect. "Just try one session," she encouraged. "See how it feels." That first therapy session was both the most difficult and most validating experience of my 19-year-old life. Dr. Chen listened to my story without interrupting, without minimizing, without trying to explain away my parents' behavior or make excuses for Marcus's theft. "What happened to you was significant trauma," she said simply. "Having your most treasured possession stolen by someone who was supposed to protect you, and then having that theft minimized by your parents, would be devastating to any child. Your feelings about this are completely valid." I cried for the entire session. Not the silent, careful tears I had learned to cry at home, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from years of stored grief. Dr. Chen sat with me through it all, offering tissues and validation and the revolutionary idea that my pain mattered. Over the next 4 years, therapy became as important to my education as my coursework. I learned about trauma responses, about how children adapt to dysfunction, about the difference between guilt and shame. I discovered that my hypervigilance wasn't a character flaw but a survival mechanism. I understood why I had become so self-reliant, why I struggled to trust others, why I felt more comfortable giving than receiving. My academic work flourished in this environment of validation and growth. I specialized in childhood trauma and family systems, drawn to research about sibling dynamics and parental favoritism. My senior thesis examined the long-term psychological effects of financial abuse within families, a topic that felt both personally meaningful and academically rigorous. The friends I made at Northwestern were unlike anyone I had known before. They came from functional families where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than reasons for shame, where achievements were celebrated rather than dismissed, where children's feelings were treated as valid and important. Being around them showed me what healthy relationships could look like. I dated some during college, but struggled with intimacy and trust in ways that my therapy sessions helped me understand. The betrayal by my family had left me with deep questions about whether anyone could truly be counted on to protect what mattered to me. Dr. Chen helped me see how this connected to my childhood experiences, but healing those wounds would be a longer process. My parents visited exactly once during my 4 years at Northwestern. They seemed uncomfortable with the person I was becoming, more confident, more articulate about my needs and boundaries, less willing to accept dismissive treatment. Marcus, meanwhile, had struggled through community college and was living at home, still financially dependent on our parents at 23. When I graduated summa cum laude with my psychology degree, my parents attended the ceremony but spent most of it talking about Marcus's latest girlfriend and his part-time job at a sporting goods store. The diploma in my hands represented 4 years of hard work, personal growth, and academic achievement, but to them it was just another piece of paper. Graduate school at the University of Chicago was where I truly found my calling. The clinical psychology program was rigorous and demanding, but every case study, every practicum hour, every supervision session felt like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. I was studying the very dynamics that had shaped my childhood, learning evidence-based interventions for the type of trauma I had experienced firsthand. My thesis focused on sibling abuse and its long-term psychological effects, a topic that still felt personally charged but was now filtered through years of therapy and academic training. Dr. Rebecca Stone, my thesis advisor, was impressed by the depth of insight I brought to the research. "You write about family trauma with unusual nuance," she told me during one of our meetings. There's an authenticity in your work that suggests personal understanding, but also the professional distance that makes for excellent clinical practice." She was right. The years of therapy had given me the tools to examine my own experiences objectively while still honoring the emotional truth of what I had lived through. I could discuss family scapegoating patterns in clinical terms while remembering exactly how it felt to be that 9-year-old girl whose grief was dismissed as dramatics. My internship placements were deliberately chosen to work with children and families experiencing similar dynamics to what I had grown up with. At the Family Trauma Center, I worked with kids who had been emotionally neglected, financially abused, or systematically favored over siblings. Their stories echoed my own in heartbreaking ways, but I was able to offer them something I had never received: validation, understanding, and practical tools for healing. One of my first clients was a 10-year-old girl named Sophie whose older brother had destroyed her art supplies in a fit of jealousy while their parents laughed it off as sibling rivalry. Watching her face crumple as she told me about her ruined paintings was like looking into a mirror of my younger self. "That must have felt terrible," I told her, and her eyes widened with surprise at being believed. "Your art was important to you, and having it destroyed by someone you trusted was a real loss." These were the words I had needed to hear 19 years earlier. After completing my doctoral degree and supervised clinical hours, I passed my licensing exam and officially became Dr. Emma Rodriguez, licensed clinical psychologist. The certificate hanging in my office represented more than professional achievement. It was proof that trauma could be transformed into purpose, that pain could become a pathway to helping others. I opened my private practice in a sunny office suite in downtown Chicago, specializing in childhood trauma, family dysfunction, and what I called invisible wounds, the psychological injuries that leave no physical scars but can shape entire lives. My waiting room filled quickly with clients who had been told they were too sensitive, who had grown up feeling invisible in their own families, who carried the weight of invalidated experiences. Word spread in the professional community about my work. I began speaking at conferences about sibling abuse and family financial exploitation, topics that were often overlooked in traditional family therapy training. Other therapists referred their most challenging family trauma cases to me, knowing I could offer both clinical expertise and lived understanding. But despite helping dozens of families heal from similar wounds, I had never fully addressed the financial injustice at the heart of my own story. That would require a different kind of intervention altogether. While I was building my career and helping families heal from trauma, Marcus was living a very different kind of life. His Facebook and Instagram feeds told the story of a 31-year-old man who had never learned to support himself. Photos of expensive dinners at trendy restaurants, weekend trips to ski resorts, and his latest acquisition, a gleaming red 2019 Ford Mustang, all funded by our increasingly enabling parents. The car was his most recent prize. According to Mom's proud Facebook post, it was an early birthday gift, because our Marcus works so hard and deserves nice things. The irony wasn't lost on me that the car cost more than my grandmother's entire doll collection, but apparently this expense was justified while replacing my stolen inheritance had been impossible. Marcus's employment history over the past decade read like a catalog of false starts and abandoned opportunities. He'd been fired from 3 different sporting goods stores for showing up late, quit a gym management position because he didn't like the hours, and most recently had been laid off from a car dealership, though Mom's worried phone call suggested the reality was more complicated. "He's just having trouble finding the right fit," she would tell me during our infrequent phone conversations. "The job market is so competitive these days." But his social media presence suggested someone who spent more time at happy hours and basketball games than job interviews. His Instagram stories were a constant stream of bar check-ins, concert tickets, and shopping sprees that would have been impossible on unemployment benefits alone. The family dynamic hadn't changed at all in the 19 years since he'd stolen my dolls. If anything, the enabling had gotten worse. Mom and Dad were now in their 60s, still working to fund Marcus's lifestyle while I had been financially independent since college graduation. They paid his rent, his car insurance, his credit card bills, and apparently now his major purchases too. During family gatherings, which I attended less and less frequently, Marcus would regale everyone with stories about his latest adventures and future plans. He was always on the verge of some great opportunity, some business venture that would make him rich, some connection that would lead to his big break. Meanwhile, my practice was thriving, I owned my own condo, and I was contributing to retirement accounts and charity organizations, but these achievements were mentioned in passing if at all. "Emma's doing well with her little therapy thing," Marcus said dismissively at last year's Christmas dinner, not looking up from his phone. "Though I still don't understand why anyone would want to listen to people complain all day." My parents nodded along, more interested in hearing about Marcus's plans to maybe start a personal training business than discussing the research paper I had just published in a major psychology journal. The Mustang represented everything wrong with the family dynamics that had shaped our childhood. It was expensive, impractical for someone without steady income, and purchased not because Marcus had earned it but because he had expressed wanting it. The same parents who had told 9-year-old me that family meant making sacrifices were now sacrificing their retirement savings to buy toys for their 31-year-old son. But unlike my 9-year-old self, I was no longer powerless to address injustice when I saw it. The breakthrough came during my own therapy session on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March. I had continued seeing Dr. Chen throughout graduate school and into my professional career, understanding that therapists need their own support systems to do this work effectively. Our sessions had evolved from processing childhood trauma to maintaining emotional wellness in a demanding career, but that day we circled back to old wounds. I had an interesting realization this week, I told Dr. Chen, settling into the familiar chair I had occupied for nearly a decade. I've been helping clients process financial abuse and family theft for years, giving them tools to set boundaries and seek justice. But I've never applied those same principles to my own situation. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging. Tell me more about that. Marcus stole $3,000 worth of my property when I was 9. In today's money, with inflation, that collection would be worth over $5,000. And not only was he never held accountable, he's been rewarded with increasingly expensive gifts ever since. I pulled out my phone and showed her Marcus's latest Instagram post, a photo of him leaning against his new Mustang with the caption, "Living my best life thanks to the best parents ever." Meanwhile, I continued, I've spent approximately $4,000 on therapy over the past 10 years. Therapy I needed largely because of the trauma from that theft and my family's response to it. The numbers had been swirling in my head all week. I had done the math obsessively, the way I did when a particularly challenging case required careful analysis. The original theft, adjusted for inflation. The cost of therapy sessions, co-pays, and out-of-pocket expenses when my insurance coverage was limited. The emotional labor of healing from wounds that should never have been inflicted. What's interesting, Dr. Chen observed, is that you're approaching this from a clinical perspective now rather than an emotional one. How does that feel different? She was right. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about the stolen dolls as a 9-year-old victim whose feelings had been dismissed. I was analyzing the situation as a professional who specialized in exactly this type of family dysfunction. It feels empowering, I admitted. Like I finally have the tools to address an injustice that's been unresolved for 19 years. And what would addressing it look like? That was the question that would change everything. In my work with clients, I always encourage them to consider what justice would actually look like, what actions would help them reclaim their power and move forward. I had never applied that framework to my own situation. I think, I said. Slowly, it would look like Marcus finally experiencing consequences for his actions. And it would look like me reclaiming the financial loss in a way that serves my healing. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Those sound like reasonable therapeutic goals. How might you pursue them? By the time I left that session, I had the beginnings of a plan that was both professionally sound and personally satisfying. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's justice, delivered with the precision of someone who understands exactly what they're doing and why. True to my nature, I approached the situation with methodical research. That weekend, I spent hours at the law library downtown, pulling statutes and case studies related to property theft, statute of limitations, and family financial abuse. The legal research was both fascinating and frustrating. While Marcus's theft had clearly been criminal, the 7-year statute of limitations for property crimes had long since expired. But my investigation wasn't about pursuing legal remedies. It was about understanding the full scope of what had happened and developing a response that would be both proportional and meaningful. I calculated the inflation-adjusted value of the doll collection using Consumer Price Index data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The $3,000 collection from 1996 would be worth $5,247 in today's dollars. I documented this carefully, printing out official inflation calculators and economic data to support my figures. Next, I tallied my therapy expenses over the past decade. Insurance copays, out-of-pocket costs when I was between jobs, the higher fees for specialized trauma therapy, it came to $4,180 in total. The correlation wasn't coincidental. I had needed professional help to heal from wounds that Marcus had inflicted and my parents had refused to address. The Mustang, according to Kelley Blue Book values, was worth approximately $22,000. Marcus had owned it for exactly 3 months, during which he had managed to accumulate parking tickets and a minor fender bender that had already required bodywork. The car was registered in his name, but the insurance and payments were handled by our parents. I spent time researching the legal process for vehicle sales, understanding lien requirements, title transfers, and the rights of registered owners. What I discovered was both simple and elegant, as the legal owner of the vehicle, Marcus, had every right to sell it. The only question was whether someone could be motivated to exercise that right. My professional training had taught me about leverage points in family systems, the moments when carefully applied pressure could shift long-standing dynamics. I understood how to motivate behavioral change, how to create consequences that would promote learning rather than simply punishment. The plan that emerged was beautifully symmetrical. Marcus would face a financial loss equivalent to what he had cost me, both in terms of the original theft and the healing expenses it had necessitated. The money would go toward therapy costs, creating a direct connection between harm and repair. And the action would be taken through Marcus's own choices rather than external force, making it impossible for my parents to frame me as the aggressor. All I needed was the right moment and the right approach. Marcus would sell his car to pay for my therapy, and he would do it because it was the only reasonable choice available to him. Sometimes the most effective interventions are the ones that feel inevitable rather than imposed. The opportunity presented itself 3 weeks later during our family's monthly dinner gathering. These events had become increasingly awkward for me over the years, forced celebrations of dysfunction where my parents performed happy family rituals, while ignoring the fundamental problems that had never been addressed. But they served my purposes now as predictable moments when all the key players would be present. I arrived at my parents' house that Sunday evening armed with a folder of documents and a calm confidence that came from weeks of preparation. Mom had made her usual pot roast, and the dining room was set with the good china that only came out for special occasions. Marcus was already there, sprawled in Dad's recliner like he owned the place, regaling our parents with stories about his latest job interview. "This marketing firm downtown is really interested in me," he was saying as I walked in. "The manager said I have exactly the kind of personality they're looking for in client relations." I had heard variations of this story dozens of times over the years. Marcus always had promising interviews, exciting opportunities, connections. Who were going to change his life? None of them ever materialized into actual employment, but our parents treated each new possibility with fresh enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said, beaming at him like he'd just announced a Nobel Prize. I knew something good would come along soon. "Speaking of good things," Marcus continued, "you should see how many compliments I'm getting on the Mustang. People at the gym keep asking about it. I'm thinking about maybe starting a car detailing business on the side." Dad nodded approvingly. "Entrepreneurship runs in the family. That's exactly the kind of initiative that leads to success." I took my usual seat at the dinner table and listened to 20 minutes of Marcus's plans and dreams while we ate Mom's overcooked roast. The conversation followed its familiar patterns: enthusiastic support for Marcus's vague ambitions, polite but minimal interest in my actual professional achievements, and comfortable avoidance of any topics that might create tension. After dinner, as Mom served dessert, Marcus pulled out his phone to show our parents photos of his car at various scenic locations around the city. The red Mustang gleamed in each shot, and Marcus's pride was evident in every carefully composed angle. "I've been thinking about maybe getting some custom modifications," he said, swiping through the images. "Maybe a better sound system, some chrome detailing. Really make it stand out." "Those modifications can be expensive," Dad noted. But his tone was indulgent rather than cautionary. "Well, I figure once I land this marketing job, I'll have plenty of money for upgrades. And besides, it's an investment. A car like this only appreciates in value if you take care of it properly." That's when I decided it was time. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice cutting through his enthusiastic monologue, "we need to talk about something important." The room fell silent. In 19 years of family dinners, I had never interrupted Marcus's stories or demanded attention for my own agenda. Mom and Dad looked surprised, while Marcus appeared mildly annoyed at having his presentation interrupted. "Can't it wait until after dessert?" Mom asked, clearly uncomfortable with any disruption to the evening's pleasant atmosphere. "Actually, it can't," I replied, opening my folder and placing the first document on the table. "This conversation is about 19 years overdue, and it involves something that belongs to Marcus." I had their attention now. Marcus's car title was right there in the folder, but he didn't know it yet. I placed the car sale receipt on the table first, letting them all see the official letterhead from Automax dealership and the transaction details before I said a word. Marcus glanced at it with mild curiosity, not yet understanding what he was looking at. "Congratulations, Marcus," I said with professional calm. Your 2019 Mustang sold for exactly $4,200 yesterday afternoon. That's precisely what I needed to cover my outstanding therapy expenses. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at the receipt, his brain clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. The sale price was listed clearly, along with the vehicle identification number that matched his beloved car. What? Marcus started, then stopped, looking from the receipt to me and back again. What is this supposed to be? It's a receipt for the sale of your car, I explained patiently, the way I might explain a diagnosis to a confused client. I sold it this morning to cover the therapy costs I've incurred over the past decade. Therapy I needed because of the trauma from having my inheritance stolen when I was 9 years old. You can't sell my car. Marcus exploded, jumping to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward. That's theft. That's illegal. I pulled out the second document, a copy of the car title transfer. Actually, it's completely legal. You signed the title over to me yesterday evening, right here in this very room. Don't you remember? Marcus's face went through several colors as he tried to understand what was happening. I never signed anything. I would never. Check your phone, I interrupted calmly. I think you'll find some interesting messages from last night. With shaking hands, Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his text history. His face went pale as he found what I knew would be there, messages he had sent the previous evening during what he probably remembered as a fun night out with friends. You got me drunk, he accused, his voice cracking with panic. I bought you drinks, I corrected. Several drinks, actually, at Murphy's Tavern. You were very talkative about your financial struggles, your job search difficulties, and how stressed you've been about disappointing mom and dad. When I suggested that selling the car might be a mature way to handle your responsibilities, you thought it was a brilliant idea. Mom and dad were both staring at me with expressions of shock and growing horror. Emma, Mom said weakly, surely you can't be serious about this. I pulled out the third document, my carefully calculated breakdown of financial damages. I'm completely serious. Marcus stole property worth $5,247 in today's money when I was 9 years old. I've spent $4,180 on therapy directly related to processing that trauma and the family's response to it. The car sale of $4,200 represents fair compensation for damages incurred. But you can't just, Dad started. I can, and I did, I replied firmly. Marcus made his decision voluntarily, in front of 3 witnesses at Murphy's Tavern. The bartender even helped him take a photo of himself signing the title transfer. He was very proud of making such a mature financial decision. Marcus was frantically scrolling through his phone now, probably looking for photos or evidence that might contradict my story. What he would find instead were selfies he had taken during his enthusiastic participation in what he had viewed as a celebration of his newfound responsibility. This is revenge, he said desperately. This is just you being vindictive about something that happened when we were kids. No, I said, standing up from the table and gathering my documents. This is justice. It's what happens when actions finally have appropriate consequences, even if it takes 19 years. You can't do this to family, Mom said, her voice breaking. I looked at each of them, my parents who had enabled Marcus's entitled behavior for 3 decades, and Marcus himself, finally experiencing what it felt like to have something precious taken away without consent. Family, I repeated quietly, is supposed to protect each other's treasures, not steal them. I learned that lesson when I was 9. It's time Marcus learned it too. I walked toward the door, leaving them with the receipts and the reality of consequences they had spent 19 years avoiding. The phone calls started within an hour of my leaving my parents' house. First Mom, then Dad, then Marcus, then all 3 of them in various combinations throughout the evening. I let each call go to voicemail, listening to increasingly frantic messages that ranged from pleading to threatening to attempts at emotional manipulation. Emma, honey, we need to fix this, Mom's first message said. This isn't who you are. You're not a vindictive person. We can work this out if we all just sit down and talk reasonably. Dad's approach was more direct. Emma, what you did was wrong, and you know it. Marcus made a mistake when you were children, but 2 wrongs don't make a right. You need to return that money and make this right. Marcus's messages grew progressively more desperate as the evening wore on. Emma, please, I need that car for job interviews. How am I supposed to get around? How am I supposed to work? You're ruining my life over something that happened 20 years ago. By the next morning, I had 17 voicemails, 43 text messages, and 6 emails all demanding that I reverse what I had done. The language escalated from requests to demands to threats about involving lawyers, though I knew that Marcus signing the title transfer while drunk wouldn't invalidate the sale legally. What struck me most about their responses was how perfectly They illustrated the family dysfunction I had spent years studying professionally. Not one of them acknowledged that Marcus had committed theft. Not one of them recognized that my need for therapy was a direct result of their dismissive response to that theft. Instead, they focused entirely on the inconvenience Marcus was now experiencing, treating my action as an unprovoked attack rather than a consequence of their own choices. I spent Monday morning drafting a letter that would serve as my final communication with all three of them. As a therapist, I understood the importance of clear boundaries and direct communication when dealing with toxic family dynamics. The letter needed to be professional, factual, and absolute. The letter read, "After careful consideration, I have decided to discontinue contact with our family. The events of this weekend have confirmed what I have understood for years, that this family system is fundamentally unable to acknowledge harm, accept responsibility, or treat all members with equal respect and dignity. Marcus's theft of my inheritance was serious trauma that required professional intervention to heal. Your collective response to both the original theft and my recent action to seek restitution demonstrates that these patterns have not changed. I will not be responding to further communications, attending family gatherings, or maintaining relationships that require me to accept mistreatment as the price of belonging. This decision is final and non-negotiable." I printed 3 copies and mailed them certified mail, requiring signatures for delivery. Then I blocked all 3 phone numbers, email addresses, and social media accounts. The silence that followed was immediate and profound. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced what it felt like to be completely free from the weight of family obligation. No more dreading phone calls about Marcus's latest crisis. No more sitting through dinners where my achievements were minimized while his failures were excused. No more carrying the emotional labor of a family that had never been willing to carry mine. The relief was overwhelming. I had finally learned what my 9-year-old self couldn't have known. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to love you properly. 2 weeks after cutting contact with my family, I did something I hadn't done since I was 9 years old. I went shopping for a doll. Not just any doll, I researched antique dealers and collectors until I found exactly what I was looking for. At a specialized shop in the Arts District, I discovered her, a porcelain beauty from 1920s France with delicate features and an elaborate silk dress that reminded me so much of my lost Marguerite that my breath caught in my throat. "She's exquisite," the shop owner said as I examined the doll carefully. "Authentic Jumeau bisque head, original human hair, and that dress is museum-quality silk. She's been well-loved but beautifully preserved." The price was $380, exactly 1 therapy session's worth of the money I had reclaimed from Marcus. The symbolism was perfect, and for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel the pure joy of acquiring something beautiful simply because it spoke to me. I brought her home and placed her on my mantelpiece, where the late afternoon light caught the delicate painting on her porcelain cheeks. Looking at her didn't bring back the grief I had expected. Instead, I felt a sense of completion, of reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried under years of hypervigilance and self-protection. The experience of standing up to my family and enforcing real consequences had transformed something fundamental in my professional work as well. My sessions with clients who had experienced similar family trauma became more powerful, more direct. I found myself less willing to accept their self-blame and more skilled at helping them identify the precise moments when boundaries needed to be enforced. "You did what?" asked Sarah, a 25-year-old client whose brother had been stealing from her for years. "You actually made him face consequences?" "I created a situation where his own choices led to natural consequences," I corrected gently. "The most effective boundaries aren't punishments we impose, they're simply refusing to protect people from the results of their own behavior." Sarah had been struggling with setting limits with her brother's financial abuse for months. Seeing that change was possible, that victims could reclaim their power, gave her the courage to close the joint bank account he had been draining and file a police report for the theft. My work with families became more nuanced too. I could identify enabling patterns more quickly, help parents understand the difference between supporting their children and handicapping them, and guide siblings through the complex dynamics of favoritism and scapegoating. The professional growth that came from finally addressing my own unhealed wounds was remarkable. I had spent years helping others find their voices while never fully using my own. Now that I had experienced what it felt like to stand up for myself, with calm, strategic determination, I could guide others through that same transformation. But perhaps the most profound change was simpler than all of that. For the first time since childhood, I felt worthy of beautiful things, and safe enough to treasure them without fear. 6 months later, I received a hand-drawn thank you card that reminded me why I had chosen this profession. The card came from 10-year-old Mia, whose older sister had been systematically destroying her artwork and whose parents had been dismissing it as normal sibling rivalry. The front of the card showed a stick figure family, but with one important detail: the little girl was standing apart from the others, surrounded by a clear, protective boundary drawn in bright purple crayon. Dear Dr. Rodriguez, the inside read in careful 4th grade handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me that my feelings matter and my art is important. My parents finally told Sarah she has to stop breaking my things or she'll lose her phone." It worked. Also, I saved my allowance and bought a lockbox for my special drawings. Love, Mia. That card sits framed on my desk now, a daily reminder of why confronting injustice, even our own, matters so much more than keeping peace. My practice has grown substantially since I learned to apply my own advice to my own life. Word spreads quickly in the therapy community when someone develops a reputation for helping clients create real change rather than just managing symptoms. I've been invited to speak at 3 conferences this year about family financial abuse and the long-term effects of invalidated childhood trauma. Marcus, according to mutual acquaintances, eventually found steady employment at a construction company after losing his car forced him to accept whatever job was available within walking distance. The experience of facing actual consequences apparently motivated changes that years of enabling never had. He's living in a studio apartment now, paying his own bills, and dating someone who expects him to contribute equally to their relationship. My parents have made a few attempts to reach out through third parties, but I've maintained my boundaries. Some relationships can be repaired, but others need to be released so that everyone involved can grow into better versions of themselves. The most important lesson I've learned is this: childhood wounds don't heal through time alone, they heal through justice, validation, and the courage to refuse mistreatment as the price of belonging. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop enabling their dysfunction, even if they never thank you for it. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's becoming so genuinely happy and successful that you no longer need anyone else's validation to know your worth. If you've experienced similar family betrayals, trust me when I say this: your feelings are valid, your experiences matter, and you deserve relationships that honor rather than diminish who you are. The path to healing might be longer than you'd like, but it's always worth taking. Share your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we stop suffering in silence.